Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this online event. My name is Matthew Harding. I'm a Professor and Dean here at the Melbourne Law School. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to this 2022 Baxt lecture featuring our guest speaker, Professor Ariel Ezrachi from the University of Oxford. Let me begin by acknowledging the country on which we are meeting. In my case, that is the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also want to pay my respects to any Indigenous Australians who are joining us for this event this evening. Let me say a word or two about the background to this Baxt lecture series. This is an annual lecture. It's presented by the Melbourne Law School jointly with the Competition Law and Economics Network. The lecture is named in honour of Emeritus Professor Bob Baxt. It honours Professor Baxt's substantial contribution to the development of competition law in this country. In particular, the lecture and the series acknowledges the significant support for the establishment of competition law as a recognised discipline at the graduate level at Melbourne Law School. Professor Baxt was the chair of the advisory board of the Competition and Consumer Law specialty in the Melbourne Law Masters program, one of his many, many significant contributions to competition law in our country. I understand there are members of Professor Baxt's family with us this evening, his wife Ruth and his daughters Miriam and Simone. Welcome to you and thank you for being here and for your strong support of this lecture series since it was first conceived. Just a few housekeeping matters before I introduce our distinguished speaker. The webinar this evening is being recorded. It will be available shortly at the website of the Melbourne Law School. Following Professor Ezrachi's lecture and the comments that will follow, there will be an opportunity for participants to ask questions. The Zoom chat function has been disabled because we are in webinar mode, but if you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be put to Professor Ezrachi for as long as time allows. I said earlier that following Professor Ezrachi's lecture, there will be comments offered. The comments will be offered by my colleague, Professor Julie Clark. Julie wears many hats here at the Melbourne Law School. She's an Associate Dean for Digital Technology, an Associate Dean for the Melbourne Law Masters program, and of particular relevance to this evening, she's the Director of Studies for Competition and Consumer Law in our Masters program. Also joining us this evening is my colleague, Associate Professor Wendy Ng, Director of our Competition Law and Economics Network. Wendy will moderate the Q&A following the lecture and the comments, and she will then close the event. Can I offer my particular thanks to Wendy for her hard work and her spirited dedication to making this lecture possible this evening. Well, I turn now to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Ariel Ezrachi. Professor Ezrachi is the Slaughter and May Professor of Competition Law at the University of Oxford and the Director of the Oxford Centre for Competition Law and Policy. He is one of the world's foremost experts on competition law and policy. He's the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Antitrust Enforcement and the author or co-author of numerous award-winning articles and books, including Competition Overdose in 2020 and the very recently released How Big Tech Barons Smash Innovation. Professor Ezrachi has also authored papers for the European Consumer Organisation, the European Commission, and the Stigler Centre at the University of Chicago. His research and commentary are featured in numerous international press outlets, such as The Economist, The New Yorker, and The Wall Street Journal. He is a member of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development Research Partnership Platform and a former non-governmental advisor to the International Competition Network. Professor Ezrachi, we are honoured that you're able to join us this evening to deliver the 2022 Baxt lecture. I now hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. So what I would like to do is share with you some thoughts about the way in which big tech platforms and ecosystems smash innovation. And I'll tell you 5 stories, or at least I'll try to squeeze in 5 stories in the time available to us. I'll first do a short primer just to explain a little bit about the digital environment and innovation in that environment. And then we'll move to see the various levers used by big tech platforms to distort innovation. We'll then look at the ripple effects, and I'll explain probably rather briefly what are the limitations of antitrust enforcement and regulation and why they are in some ways handicapped in their ability to deal with the story of innovation that I'm going to share with you this evening. So let us begin with a few comments on the digital environment. And I often start by just voicing a health warning and say that, of course, we all benefit from the digital environment, from platforms, from ecosystems. So our discussion today is not an attempt to argue against innovation, against digitalization. Of course not. The counterfactual is not a world without digitalization. It is a world in which we, as consumers, as society, benefit from all that digital platforms have to offer. But at the same time, we probably try and do a slightly better job in addressing some of the externalities and the problem that they generate. Now, when you think about digital dynamics, the digital environment, a good place to start is to appreciate how these dynamics differ from our traditional high street. So if you think about the market dynamics when it comes to platforms, when it comes to ecosystems, just to websites or applications, certain elements turn these markets to be rather unique. What you see in front of you on the slide is a long list, and I'm not going to go through all the points, but the key characteristics are that in digital markets, we tend to have very strong network effects that, of course, we see elsewhere, but not to that extent, both direct network effects, but also indirect network effects. And these network effects tend to enable those in power to gather more and more power. They also tend to increase the switching cost of us as users. And over time, they result in the creation of key gatekeepers or key platforms that all of us chose willingly to treat as our entry point into the internet or the digital ecosystem. And in those ecosystems, another element is, of course, the role of data. Data has always played a significant role in formation, a significant role in markets. But online, of course, we have big data. We have data that concerns us as users, but also data that concerns the dynamics of the market. And when you apply to that big data also big analytics, advanced algorithms that can predict and identify patterns, then what you have are powers that enable those on the other side of the market to exercise certain strategies that otherwise would be very difficult. And this leads us to an interesting asymmetry in power. Often, when we go online, when we're using digital appliances, there is a very clear asymmetry in terms of the analytical power, the autonomy, the ability to make decisions between us and those on the other side of the market, either the sellers, the service providers, the platforms. And that is particularly so because of the stealth mode in which those markets operate. Few of us are actually aware of the full extent to which our mobile phone, for example, extract data from us, the extent to which we are being tracked on a daily basis, maybe by our wearables, maybe by our smart gadgets at home. So we have a certain idea of autonomy, but it is certainly undermined by that reality of digital environment. And in that environment, what we see is that markets tend to tip in favor of the winner. And we call it winner takes all or most markets. And the result, of course, is the rise of a handful of key players, which we refer to as the game makers, those who actually set the game and control a lot of what is happening online. So these big tech barons, these large companies in the West, we often refer to GAFAM, but we have very similar situation in the East. What really characterizes them is the control not only over significant interfaces, but the fact that they were able to grow and grow in size and create an ecosystem. And here, for competition lawyers and economists, we have an interesting distinction, because whereas traditionally we tended to treat those companies as large companies on the market, the reality is that many of them are the market. So one thing to appreciate is that when you enter an ecosystem, you entered a private market, a market that is controlled by a company that determines the entry conditions, determines the level of information exchange on the platform, determines the tax that you will pay. For us as users, usually the tax involves data or payment, determines the tax that service providers will pay, and control all the parameters of competition. Often when you go online, you might have the impression that you are exposed to something that is very similar to real competition, but it is only because those ecosystems at a given moment decided to reflect a similar situation. So it may be quite confusing, but the reality is that the invisible hand of competition that we associate with free markets does not exist to its full extent once you deal with ecosystems. In the ecosystem, you have a digitalized hand that often imitates the invisible hand of competition, but sometimes to advance the interest of the ecosystem or the platform will determine the winners of and losers of tomorrow. So with that introduction, let's move to look more closely at the story of innovation. So what are the effects of innovation? If you ask the CEOs of the leading tech companies, they will tell you stories that will support what we refer to as the ideological platter, that support the idea that no matter what are your beliefs as to innovation and power, they are doing the right thing. From an economic perspective, we have different approaches to innovation. There are some theories that suggest that innovation is related to market power. The Schumpeterian insights here would suggest that you need market power to benefit from the innovation, the externalities, and therefore there is an interesting correlation there. There is the Ariel perspective that will attach innovation to a competitive process, and we also have the inverted U. And the interesting thing that we see is, and these are quotes from testimonies that were given to the US Congress, you see that the CEOs of the leading tech companies try to hit all the possible theories. So Jeff Bezos, when he speaks about innovation, he gives credit to the small innovators, but he highlights the need for a large company to achieve significant innovation. If you think about Tim Cook and Apple, he is putting more emphasis on the way in which the competition to which Apple is exposed really drives the innovation that it promotes. And many of them also toy with the idea of competition between the ecosystem that challenge them and results in innovation. And overall, what you will find is that these stories are quite successful. There is a general sense when we speak with policymakers in some jurisdictions that those companies, those big tech barons, are indeed the engines of innovation. And to be clear, of course, they do advance a lot of innovation. The story is a bit nuanced, but they are also stifling plenty of innovation. But let's just identify some of the ideologies that are being pushed by these big tech barons. Often, we will be told that what they can provide, no other company can provide. The sheer scope and scale of their operation cannot be matched by others. Not only it cannot be matched by others, even the state cannot deliver us those innovations. They are essential. We often have an image of a coral reef. The platforms attract innovators into the market and facilitate the access of small, medium-sized firms to the market. And we shouldn't worry about their market power because disruption is just around the corner. And of course, when we look at the investment that they make into research and development, we should really understand that there is no parallel in industry to such ratios of investment. This is the ideology that many people, I assume also some of you, have been exposed to for many years. The reality is slightly different. Some of the points here, for instance, in terms of investment and the state, we can see that a lot of the innovations that are speculative, a lot of the innovations that are very costly were initially pushed by the state. We can see that public resources are used heavily to advance areas of innovations where you cannot internalize immediately the profits. We will see, and I will explain to you how instead of being a coral reef, what we have are platforms that are almost, imagine a coral reef covered with algae that controls who can access the reef. And disruptive innovation isn't really around the corner. In reality, what we have is an ecosystem that is engaged in a very selective promotion of innovation. And what they do, what those ecosystems do, is they allow innovation that supports their profit engine, their value chain. But what they will do is they will quash any innovation that is disruptive, that might give rise to an alternative ecosystem, or might destabilize their profit mechanism. So whereas the story of innovation that we often hear would lead us to think that we need as a society to bet on those big tech companies, the reality is that they distort plenty. And the problem we have here is that our policies for many years have been based on the assumption that those companies invest heavily in innovation, and this quantitative measure had led us to put our trust in them. And what you see in front of you on the slide is what we call the 1 in 60 rule. Anyone who's done navigation in the past, either airplanes or boats, will be familiar with that. The rule is very simple. 1 degree error would lead you to 1 meter of your target for every 60 meters that you're moving forward. And I'm using this rule just to highlight something. If you think of the past 30 years, and you think that the mistakes we made with our understanding of innovation and the way leading digital platforms or leading players distort innovation, if we were just 1 degree off target, as you move on with the years, it makes you understand why we are so far away from the desired outcome. And while the rhetoric is still very dominant, you will still come across the rhetoric that suggests that those big tech platforms are delivering maximum innovation to us. The reality is that we are very far off target. So how did we get here? Let me now explain a little bit about the various levers that are used by those platforms to distort innovation. And remember, we're talking about platforms that are controlling markets. We're talking about Facebook, about Google, about Amazon. They don't only play and operate on a market. There is a whole market activity that happens within those platforms. So the various levers are described here in this illustration. You can see the ecosystem, and within the ecosystem, the tech barons can distort the supply of innovation. They can distort the demand for innovation, and then they can create effects outside the ecosystem. Let me go through some of them rather briefly. Let's talk about the distortion of supply of innovation. How can they know what to distort? Monopolies for years have always feared the disruptor. But what monopolies didn't have is the now casting radar, the ability to see the ecosystem in the way that our big tech barons can. Because in real life, the essence of disruption is that you don't know about it until it suddenly come and hit you. But in the online system, very large platforms are able to deploy programs and algorithms that can assess the likelihood of a competitor either disrupting or rising to become a competing ecosystem. One example is Onavo, a program that was purchased by Facebook, and Onavo was central in Facebook's ability to identify WhatsApp as a threat. Now, what does it mean, identify a company as a threat? So let's take another example. Think of Amazon, for example. I might be a seller on Amazon, and I think that I'm making nice progress with whatever product that I have. But now think about what Amazon knows about me that I don't even know. Amazon knows what queries and what searches are being run. It knows how much traffic could have reached me if it wasn't for certain design features that they implemented. It can identify what is the growth trajectory. And in a way, Amazon can know more about my potential, the interest in my product category than I know at a given moment. It can enable big tech platforms to identify disruptors even before those disruptors know that they have the potential to gain scale and become valid disruptors on the market. And with that, platforms can execute various instruments to quash innovation that they consider to threaten their profit-making mechanism. The first example will be when those platforms try to exclude innovators. Why would they exclude innovators? A very nice example concerns Disconnect and Google. Google ecosystem is based on harvesting data, using that data in order to power the advertising machine, and being able to target us as individuals. Disconnect was created as a company with the aim of protecting our privacy. Their initial feature was an application that you could load on your mobile, and when any other application is trying to harvest your data, Disconnect will tell you about it. It will disconnect the other application, prohibit it from selling your data or transferring your data, and let you know about it. Google delisted Disconnect from the shop. Basically, remove Disconnect as a viable option that we can access through the Google shop. Why? Once you think about the profit motive, about the value chain, it becomes obvious. Disconnect basically is a disruptor. This is a technology that has the potential to undermine the value chain. So when a tech baron identifies technology that can disrupt its ecosystem, what it can do at the extreme is just block the access of that technology into the ecosystem. As it does so, it reduces the volume of users that, of course, will access that technology, and in doing so, reduces the validity of that technology. Without scale, most new developers, most innovators basically are being pushed out of the market. But it's not only about excluding players from the market completely. You can also just reduce the interoperability between those who supply innovation and the ecosystem. Think about interoperability as a bridge that makes sure that an application will work really well when you're using it. If I have an application that is disruptive, if I have an application that is undermining my interests, what I can do is just reduce the interoperability. As the platform, I can provide them with less information, less capacity to work well on my platform. And now think about yourself as users. When you are using a service or an application and they don't work well, you never blame the platform, you blame the application. So reduced interoperability enables ecosystems to damage the ability of innovations to reach the market. And the third option that is open when we come to the supply of innovation is, of course, just copying. Basically removing the scale of the competitor by copying features from the competitor. Think of Facebook and Snapchat. And the important thing when you copy something, Facebook looks at Snapchat, identifies Snapchat as a certain threat, makes an offer to Snapchat, Snapchat refuses. By copying the features, you are able to reduce the switching of consumers and users. Because I don't need to be, if I'm the incumbent, and I have you already in my ecosystem, and being an ecosystem already implies that I have the benefit of having the majority of users with me, I don't need my services to be as good as the disruptor. I just need them to be good enough, so switching will be too costly. In other words, for the ecosystem, the harder it is to switch, the less their services need to be as good as the disruptor. Another way to look at it is to understand the disruptors in our very concentrated reality have to be much better than the incumbent in order to convince us to switch. The mirror image of that is to look at the ability of ecosystems and tech barons to distort our demand for innovation. Now, most of us have a real sense of autonomy. I'm sure all of you have a real sense that you determine what you read every day, you determine what you shop, and you definitely determine how you feel about society, politics, or anything around you. So let me start with a little story about the black-cap birds. Black-caps, and that's a story that I heard here at Pembroke College, and I think it's just a beautiful story to illustrate what I'm trying to highlight. Black-caps spend their winter in Eastern Europe, those birds. But in the winter, they migrate to Northern Africa because it's warm and it's lovely. But since the 60s, more and more black-caps started to fly to the UK in the winter. Now, there are many good things about the UK, but a pleasant winter is not one of them. But apparently what happened was that people in the UK started to feed birds over the weekend, over the winter months. So a culture began where there are more and more private bred feeders spread around. And for the black-caps, coming to Britain in the winter was pretty much similar to going to Las Vegas and enjoying a breakfast buffet. It was just something they couldn't ignore. So many of them stopped flying to Africa and actually spent the winter here in the UK. Why am I telling you that? Because despite the fact that many of us think that we're very special, we're not that different from the black-cap birds. For many of us, if someone puts enough food or enough benefit or something that is perceived as useful to us somewhere, we follow that. It is actually quite easy to manipulate the way we behave. When it comes to innovation, that means that our path to adopting new innovation, disruptive innovation, can be affected by the ecosystem. You probably heard about dark patterns. You probably are aware of various ways in which we can control decision-making. And what you see here are all the paths through which you can distort the decision-making that one is making when it comes to adopting innovation. Now, many times people are a bit skeptical about how susceptible they are to manipulations, even the simplest manipulations. So I'll just tell you one story to highlight how powerful dark patterns are. And this is not a story about dark patterns. It's just a story about very basic bias. And I'm going to use judges because we all assume that judges in their decision-making have a more structural approach. So in this experiment, judges with 10 years experience or more were giving a scenario, and they were asked to determine what would be the sentencing adequate for the specific violation. They were divided into two groups. And the difference between the groups was that the first group was asked a very simple question by an interviewer. Do you think the sentence is going to be more or less than 1 year? And the second group was asked by the interviewer a different question. Do you think your sentence is going to be more or less than 3 years? This is called anchoring, where you just plug a number in the head of the person you chat to. The gap, the average gap between the two groups was 8 months. So this is just kind of a little anecdote to highlight how easy it is to determine the way we think. Now think about the online environment, dark patterns, the ability to create friction that prevents you from going somewhere, reduce friction to enable you to go elsewhere, create various elements. And there are over 100 biases that are used these days online. By the way, we're running an experiment in Oxford where we have a website for financial services that is part of this experiment. We service people with dark patterns to see how they are susceptible to dark patterns. And I can tell you that it is sometimes quite sad to realize how easy it is to lead people to make a certain decision rather than other. In the story of innovation, that means that ecosystems have a significant power to affect our choice as to innovation, to affect the payment system you will choose, the privacy setting you will choose. And in doing so, the ability of small, medium-sized innovators of actually reaching the market. Now, this also goes beyond the ecosystem. Of course, what happens is that because the ecosystems and the leading big tech barons try to only promote innovation that sustain their value chain and try to block innovation that is disruptive, you can imagine as if we have a beam of light that leaves the ecosystem. And if your innovation serves the ecosystem, then it will be within that beam of light and you will get funding. But if your innovation is outside, in the industry, we call this the elephant path. You will basically be quashed because there is no way for you to reach the ecosystem. They will just not let you in. What it means is that if you're a true disruptor, you will find it very difficult to have any funding because angels and venture capital companies are not there for charity, they're there for money. And they understand very clearly where the money is, where the potential is. If you're a disruptor with a chance, then of course, then we have killer acquisitions that have been used in the past to quash possible disruption. And we have instances in which those ecosystems identify alternative ecosystems that might rise and also try to block them. On top of that, when you look outside the ecosystems, you also see how the knowledge economy is affected. You can see how the money, because those big tech barons are cash rich, the money enables them to distort public investment in knowledge, distort the allocation of knowledge. It enables them to capture and commercialize a lot of innovations that are, or at least began in the public sphere, and then when they are captured, turn them into the value chain or bring them into the value chain. The result of all of it is that the plurality of innovation that we have is being diminished. What you have is perhaps a lot of investment in innovation, but in terms of the quality of innovation in the digital landscape, a lot of that innovation is now driven by the profit motive and the value chains advanced by big tech barons. And this leads us to basically the effects that creates. And those are really significant effects because you have to understand the 1 in 60 rule tells you why we are so far off target today. But it also gives you the ability to appreciate how us getting it wrong now will affect future generations as we look forward. And the first thing is reduce plurality. And here you, on the slide, you have an image that reflects the golden age of Islam. And this is kind of in the 8th century in Baghdad. This was the center of innovation, the global center for innovation. And what was unique about it was that Baghdad was open. It was plural. Regardless of your religion, origin, you were welcome there. And indeed, a lot of the medicine knowledge that we have can be traced back to then. Biology, science, astronomy, math, all of these have their origin in that golden age. But toward the 14th century, some changes, some religious clerics decided to close off Baghdad, and the center for innovation went elsewhere, just drifted to other locations. Why am I telling you that anecdote? Because this is exactly what we're doing. We're reducing plurality, and by reducing plurality, we're restricting innovation. We might not feel it yet, but what we're doing is we're undermining the future of innovation. And whereas in the story of Baghdad, there was another city, in the story of global digital innovation, there isn't another planet in which you have alternative effort, alternative investment in more plural innovation. Another thing that we identify is that with the rise in market power, we found ourselves now receiving more innovation that is detached from our desires as consumers and citizens. We speak here about the value of innovation in terms of society. And what you see is that when you have platforms and ecosystems that work in a competitive environment, they are constrained by our desires. Nice example is when Facebook changed the privacy settings in the early days when MySpace was still a viable competitor, and Mark Zuckerberg came out and apologized because there was a real criticism, and he said, we got it wrong, we apologize. No one expects such apology these days as our privacy is diminished if you are on Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp. Why? Because with market power comes the ability to behave independently of consumers and users and competitors. The same happens with the value, the nature of innovation. With market power comes the ability to advance innovation that services your profit motive rather than the greater good. And indeed, as we go and look at patents that are registered, you will see that most of the ecosystems are now busy investing in technologies that are about harvesting more data, identifying patterns, identifying emotional traits, manipulating, being able to read your thoughts based on eye movements, keyboard, any movement that you make. And with the metaverse, with other instruments around us, we are becoming an open book, but in a way in which innovations are likely to be deployed against our personal interest. And the ripple effects, you can already see them now, because those value chains that I described and the lack of plurality of innovation and some pushback from the industry result in those ecosystems being able to advance certain profit engines regardless of the consequences. So if you think about societal effect, tribalism, friction, all of them can be traced back to algorithms that rewards negativity, for instance. 64% of people that joined hate groups did so on a recommendation of algorithms. There's an interesting quote after riots that were in one country where one of the politicians said, the germs are ours, meaning that hate was already there, but Facebook provided the wind. But the reality is that our inability to protect plurality and our captivation with the idea that those big tech barons are providing the innovation we crave led us to basically fail to protect society. I'm sure you heard about Cambridge Analytica, and we're a bit short with time, so there's no need for me to go on with that. But the reality is that what happens online doesn't stay online. This may be a story about digital innovation, but the ripple effects are felt by all of us every day. And the quote that you see at the bottom of the slide is from one of the leaks from Facebook, where when there was the whole controversy about them manipulating individuals, one of the officials said, you know, don't worry, this will pass. And meanwhile, we'll keep on printing money in the basement. Okay, so let's have two very short concluding remarks. The story of innovation is complex and very nuanced because, of course, on one hand, big tech barons do invest a lot in sustaining innovation. They also disrupt outside their ecosystem, but then they link it to their own value chain. But at the same time, they also distort a lot of innovation. And in a way, us betting on them as the leaders of the future results in a massive narrowing of the spectrum of innovation that we receive and has significant consequences. Antitrust, although we speak about innovation a lot of the time, is not very effective because innovation is dynamic and we tend to adopt a rather static approach to antitrust. So this is one problem, that although we speak about innovation, almost like the weather, we all talk about the weather, but there is often little we can do about it. Pretty much the same with innovation and antitrust. Regulation, certainly, if you look at the DMA and the DSA, can have, in Europe, can have a significant effect. But remember, it was never designed to deal with the problems that we are describing now, because it is mostly designed to deal with what happened in the past. And here, the story of duck hunting is quite interesting. A lot of our regulations, instead of aiming ahead of the duck, aim behind the duck. So instead of understanding that technology is advancing and our regulation has to be dynamic enough to go forward, what we do is we at best aim at the duck. And ducks don't even know that you aim at them. Big tech barons do know that, and they can take evasive maneuvers. So what we need to do is just appreciate that the value chain, the incentives that drive big tech barons are the source of a lot of the distortions that we have. These days, in our analysis, there is very little attention to these elements. There is also us basically assuming that investment in innovation, a quantitative measure, is a good indication of value, where in reality, we need to take a qualitative approach. And the third element to highlight is that we must be much more aware of diversity. If we look at these three principles, then maybe we can have a better chance when we design our policies in terms of laws or the way that we support innovation, and make sure that we can make sure that the right type of innovation reaches the market. I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ariel, for your provocative address. I think you've painted a frightening picture of the ways in which tech barons can distort both the supply and demand of value-creating innovation, the implications this might have for society at large, and the importance of employing a holistic suite of policy levers to meaningfully respond, or, as your book suggests, strike. I want to make a few general comments on the themes of the paper and then consider the Australian context. 35 years ago, the inimitable Professor Eleanor Fox penned The Battle for the Soul of Antitrust. And despite some shift towards a more interventionist approach at the time, the question of antitrust soul was clearly not resolved, and 30 years later, a new battle's emerged. Once again, as Ariel and his co-author Morris have observed, there's a fight over antitrust soul. And this is driven largely by the rise of big tech, and as Ariel noted, the questions that it raises about concentrated market power and associated concentration of wealth, political and social influence. The consumer welfare standard and the central role of price and output is under renewed attack. And this time, I think it feels a bit different and it feels global. The debate is, as Ariel's noted, fairly polarized and the stakes are very high. Big tech have much to gain by retention of the status quo and enjoy an impressive range of allies. But there's also a growing concern that toxic innovation, driven by the incentives and value chains that Ariel's described, are, again in the words of Ariel and Morris in Big Tech Barons, ripping apart our social fabric and undermining political stability and democracy. Ariel and Morris are leaders in the modern antitrust battlefield, and of course the related policy fields touching on this area, attacking some of the core weapons used by big tech in their effort to retain the status quo. And I think the arguments are compelling, in particular the need to better interrogate assumptions about the value of innovation, investment and competition when formulating an appropriate policy suite. The ferocity of the battle is perhaps less intense in Australia, but nevertheless rages, including in the form of ongoing market studies by the ACCC. And there the ideological platter described by Ariel is easily recognised in many big tech submissions. For example, Google's submission to the Competition Policy Review described the internet as rocket fuel for small business and insisted that competition is always only one click away because switching is easy. In any event, they claimed we shouldn't worry because if issues do emerge, the dynamic nature of the market will facilitate market solutions. There's no doubt, as Ariel observed, that big tech and the ecosystems it supports have produced highly valued goods and have encouraged positive innovation, at least where not challenging their ecosystems. And so, as Ariel mentioned, it's easy to understand why lobbying that highlights those benefits and warns that any change to the legal and regulatory status quo risks stifling innovation and causing irreparable economic damage has proven an effective weapon against any reform. I'm sure we all agree that care must be taken when setting policy and developing associated laws and regulations to avoid unintended consequences, including stifling value-creating innovation. And this is, of course, recognised by policymakers and competition authorities. Equally, however, consideration must be given to the full consequence of retaining the status quo, in this case largely built upon assumptions about the inherent goodness of all innovation and all competition and complete faith in market self-correction. Ariel's argued that the way forward to encourage tech pirates and promote plurality of value-enhancing innovation requires policymakers and enforcers to consider three principles: value, incentives, and diversity. And as Ariel noted, competition-specific reform obviously can't address all the potential harm associated with toxic innovation and its social implications, but it still has some role to play as an important policy lever. So turning to the Australian context specifically, I think there is here a tendency, as elsewhere, to value innovation as inherently good. But there is also recognition, I think, that competition isn't always king and must be balanced against broader social values. Now, debate about what our social values actually are and the extent to which we should intervene to protect them will continue, as it should, and as it does in other areas of public policy. And I think it's fair to say that there are here a range of policy levers being considered to address some of the concerns that Ariel's identified, including, for example, around privacy, fair trading, and other consumer laws. But given the forum, I do want to focus on the competition policy lever. And despite good intentions, our laws and many law reform proposals do suffer from the limitations described by Ariel as they relate to innovation and big tech barons. In particular, our laws predominantly target past restraints and the glacial speed of enforcement as means that, as Ariel describes, big tech may win the war despite periodic defeats in courtroom battles. And it's also not obvious that our laws, which still focus heavily on market definition, respond particularly well to the complexities of the ecosystems that are orchestrated by the big tech barons. Significantly, however, the ACCC is in the midst of a 5-year inquiry into digital platform services conducted at the direction of the former Treasurer, who, when announcing the inquiry, highlighted the increasing importance of digital technologies to both our economic and social landscape, with reforms to be designed to ensure that we get the balance right. As part of the inquiry, in February this year, the ACCC released a discussion paper titled Updating Competition and Consumer Law for Digital Platform Services. It has unsurprisingly sparked vigorous debate. In addition to considering reform to competition laws, the paper also considers a wider set of possible levers, including regulation and codes of conduct. Ariel's perhaps slightly disturbing duck hunting reference can be considered when evaluating some of the proposed reforms. It's clear that some of them will risk shooting where the proverbial duck was and not where it's going. So self-preferencing, for example, features heavily in the paper, with several options mooted to address the competition concerns they raise. Now, these reforms might still be important, of course, and catch some important ducks, but might not have an enduring impact. But there are broader measures being considered, such as in relation to data portability and interoperability, which may, in Ariel's words, make it slightly harder to kill the tech pirates. And there are also some adaptive tools being considered, which might better facilitate capture of any future as yet unknown anti-competitive conduct, for example, in the form of mandatory industry codes. Key among the competition law and enforcement reforms proposed is an overhaul of Australia's merger laws. Australia currently adopts a voluntary, informal, non-suspensory notification regime. And in August last year, then chair of the ACCC, Rod Sims, argued that these laws were failing to adequately protect competition, with a particular concern being the alleged inability of those laws to capture the strategic acquisition of nascent rivals by digital platforms, or killer acquisitions, as Ariel mentioned. Forward-looking merger tests that focus on proof, and the CSI proof at that, of a future substantial reduction in competition means detecting and blocking these sorts of nascent acquisitions is difficult, if not impossible. And this is, of course, a concern shared by other regulators, with nascent tech acquisitions identified by Ariel as a key weapon employed by big tech barons to kill potential pirates. The discussion paper observes, consistent with Ariel's observations, that strategic acquisitions like this can distort investment by encouraging incremental rather than disruptive innovation, and may further reduce the competitive constraint on digital platforms. So a series of economy-wide merger reforms have been suggested, including introducing a mandatory suspensory regime that would be administered by the ACCC with a reverse onus of proof. And the ACCC is considering whether lower notification thresholds should apply to digital platforms, as well as potentially lowering the threshold for contravention for those platforms. The big tech barons have, of course, responded, and Meta, for example, argues that the contention that mergers potentially harm innovation undervalues the important role that acquisitions play as part of the global innovation ecosystem, and again warns of the risk to investment and innovation if proposed reforms proceed. On the other hand, if enacted in whole or part, the merger reforms may help limit tech barons' ability at least to acquire nascent competitive threats, with the consequence that they may, again in the words of Ariel and Morris, remove some torpedoes from their arsenal. Eleanor Fox's Battle for the Soul paper argued that the real battle wasn't about where correct economics leads, but was about fundamentally different views concerning law and society. I think the same is true of today's battle, and the implications of getting it right, not just in antitrust, but more broadly, are skillfully expounded in big tech barons. Ariel's made a compelling case for the need to change some long-standing assumptions and has provided useful guidance for policymakers when considering the way forward. In Australia, the suite of reviews and proposals being considered could and should draw on this guidance to help ensure that policy levers that are engaged avoid competition overdose, encourage a plurality of value-creating innovation, enable the tech pirates the opportunity to prosper, and perhaps further limit damage to our social fabric from toxic innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for your comments. We've got a couple of minutes for some audience questions. So, Professor Ezrachi, the first question we have is, have pharma barons become the new tech barons?
Have pharma barons become the new tech barons? Well, I think pharma barons have always been barons. So in that respect, we all appreciate that some of the themes that I described are also very relevant, but the levers are different. I mean, we don't have time, but of course, if you think about the interface is slightly different. It is about identifying which medicines will be in the basket, identifying which technologies, which medicines are being invested and demand, and so forth. But certainly, the story of ecosystems is not limited only to the online. It's just that in the online, we really see the distortions in ways that I think many of us may have not appreciated until now.
Thank you. The next question is, does it make it more important to not have big tech companies buy up small startup and innovators so as to have a diversity of innovation? So can a very blunt instrument be used to help preserve that innovation and the variety of?
So we need to be very careful when we're thinking about what are the policy choices, and just understand that every move you make has a cost and has a benefit. And therefore, this is why this is a nuanced story. This is not a story in which you would argue that big tech is ruining everything. This is a story where if you understand the levers, if you understand the value chain and the profit motives, you can utilize tools that are more proportionate and still achieve the goal. The risk with breaking everyone is that, of course, a lot of the efficiencies and benefits disappear, not to mention that you might chill investment in innovation and chill competition overall. So especially for competition lawyers and economists, when we think about it, we don't think about it like politicians that just want to give a solution. We think about it in a way that we want the market to work as best as it can. And because of that, it is all about the nuance. I sometimes imagine it as a very old cockpit of an old plane where you have too many switches, and this is what we have in front of us. And our task is to identify which of those switches we need to turn up or down and how to turn the dials so we can get the result we desire without going to the main switch and then turning the power off completely.
Seems like there are a lot of aviation analogies are apt in this area. Do we know how stable the monopolies of the big tech barons are? We used to be worried about monopolization of the operating system, with Bill Gates claiming that the desktop is the most valuable real estate. We then worried about who controlled the browser, our window to the internet. Then came portals such as Yahoo, then search engines, then social platforms. So who knows what the next battlefield will be? And so the world may, after all, be Schumpeterian, where monopolies are threatened by the next innovative monopoly.
So this is an argument that you hear very, very, very often, and Julie alluded to that argument. And this is where the policy debate really happens. Andreas Moon, the head of the Bundeskartellamt, a few years back in Oxford, said something quite interesting. He told someone who said competition is a click away, he told him, the competitor may be a click away, but competition isn't. And the difference is the fact that big tech barons can identify various companies and tell us a story. It's fine. But the age of MySpace being displaced by Facebook was in the past. It doesn't mean that Facebook might not be displaced, but what it means is that in their arsenal, they have so many more tools to enable them to control that environment. So when you think about the ecosystem, when you think about the torpedoes that affect supply of innovation, the ability to affect demand of innovation, and you think about the deep pockets, and to some extent our, as a society, inability, to address some of the killer acquisitions, you realize that there is an ongoing, this is not a static story. In this story, those big tech barons are investing anything in their power to make sure the disruption will not happen. Now, again, it doesn't mean that they will always be there, but what it means is that they prolong their stay well beyond what a typical market would suggest. And it also doesn't mean, of course, that they are just bad. All it means is that we need to think very carefully as to the extent we should allow them to distort the landscape for innovation.
Thank you. And one final question. How does toxic competition interact with toxic innovation in the tech baron ecosystem, thereby bringing your two books together?
So it's a very good question. And the answer is a bit long, but just briefly, toxic competition is about us as society really being captivated with the idea that we can outsource most of our problems to competition. In the book Competition Overdose, when we speak about toxic competition, we explain that sometimes competition can just be toxic, like a race to the bottom. So there can be instances where you think that competition will be the answer, but if you understand the dynamic of competition, you realize that it's definitely not the solution. It will even make things worse. And there is a call for some government intervention. In a way, toxic innovation doesn't relate to a similar dynamic. It relates to the reality of advancing innovation that doesn't serve our needs. But more broadly, the concept of big tech barons does have some parallels in the sense that you might assume that when someone is waving a lot of cash and is telling you that they're investing billions in research and development, everything is good. And your instinct might be, as a government or local government, to go and give those companies the big projects. Your instinct might be to go and say, hey, we want Melbourne to be a smart city. Hey, come here, big tech baron, take the money. And that is the instinct you need to control, because the reality is that this is the wrong thing to do. You can use some levers to encourage some plurality and ensure that you are not part of the problem.
Thank you very much. And so with that, I'd like to draw this year's Baxt lecture to a close. Once again, on behalf of Melbourne Law School and the audience, thank you to Professor Ezrachi for delivering this year's lecture. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Julie again for her comments, and also Emily from the events team at Melbourne Law School for assistance in organising this event, and of course to the Baxt family for their continuing support of the lecture. Thank you to everyone who attended and joined us tonight. We hope to welcome you back to the law school for next year's Baxt lecture. Good night from Melbourne.